right, so I am assuming that this means that we have everybody on the call, or at least enough to begin here. We're going to talk today about the demographic assumptions and factors that go into the models that we use for the fiscal plan. Now, I should say a little bit about how this is going to go. One second, there we go. So due to very high participation, I believe we have, I think 160 registrations. I'm not sure how many are on the call right now. But instead of having this just be sort of a freewheeling back and forth, we have had to mute you guys. But to ask questions, what you can do is you can use the chat box, which is an option on your screen, and just direct questions to everyone. So if I say something and you have a question about it, just type a question into the chat box, direct it to everyone, and I will attempt to answer it as I'm able. At the end, I will go back through and try and see if there are any unanswered questions. And if there are, I will try and find a way to go back to those. So just as an example, you could say, how does this thing work? And there we are. Everyone should see this question from me in their chat box. How does this thing work? So that's how I'll receive questions. I do ask if you could keep the questions sufficiently brief and specific that I don't have to read through a paragraph-long explanation to get to the question. Finally, I am sharing my screen here, which has the PowerPoint that I'm working from. Probably the easiest way for you to view it and follow what's going on is the floating panel view. You should be able to do that and follow along with the presentation and I think also the chat feature as well. Okay, so with that, we'll get into the fun part, a disclaimer. So basically the following analysis presents the demographic assumptions that we've used for the Certified Fiscal Plan and for the Certified Fiscal Plan revision process. This analysis is being delivered only for informational purposes. It is preliminary. It's always subject to modification and revision, and we are not making any particular express representation or warranty as to the accuracy or completeness of the information here, particularly given that it is a forecast. There is always forecast uncertainty. Any estimates or projections contained herein are based upon estimates and projections provided by the FOMB and involve numerous significant subjective determinations which may or may not prove to be accurate or complete. Accordingly, no representation or warranty can be made or is made by the FOMB or its advisors as to the accuracy or achievability of any such valuations, estimates, or projections. We have not independently verified or approved any of this information beyond the normal process that we have. Estimates, and that includes the estimates and projections there. And nothing here is or shall be relied upon as a promise or representation as to the past, present, or future. This analysis does not purport to be all-inclusive or contain all the information that a recipient might desire in investigating matters or any transaction pertaining to the FOMB or any governmental entity. Each recipient of the analysis should conduct their own investigation and analysis of any information contained herein, including but not limited to projections, forecasts, and estimates. In furnishing this analysis, neither the FOMB nor its advisors or any other professional or agent undertakes any obligation to provide the recipient with access to any additional information or to update or otherwise revise this analysis following its distribution. Under no circumstances should the delivery of this analysis imply that any information, estimates, or projections included in this analysis would be the same if made as of any other date. So I read that whole thing to you, and the long and short of this is I want to be able to have a discussion here. I want to talk about this, but this is exemplary and informative. And crucially, I'm not going to present anything here that is either novel, so I'm not going to release any new information here that is not in some sense previously released or previously stated. And furthermore, the actual numbers that I'll be working with in this spreadsheet are not specific to any specific released fiscal plan. They are illustrative. They are very, very similar to what's in some of the previous fiscal plans. They are not identical to what has been published anywhere. And the reason is that I wanted to give you all an illustration of the assumptions we used as they show up not only in previous fiscal plans, but as they could in the future. But the point is, they are not a promise for a specific fiscal plan. They are illustrative about how we do this and the types of assumptions we use. And most components are not widely differing across plans. Finally, before we go on, I do want to say one thing about the demographic forecasting error we had for June, and this will be the entire discussion of this topic. This is all we'll say on the source of that error, and then we'll go on and talk about the future. So, in the interest of ensuring that all stakeholders continue to regard FOMB's macroeconomic and demographic forecasts as transparent and reliable, we want to begin the call by briefly addressing the previously reported demographic error in the Certified June Fiscal Plan. As that plan was being prepared, board advisors, including myself, were working on the macroeconomic and population models underlying the fiscal plan, and we were also stress testing those models with different future scenarios as part of our normal model testing and validation procedures. This work was being done simultaneously with fiscal plan recertification. Unfortunately, given the expedited nature of the June fiscal plan certification, a procedural error led to the demographic model being given an incorrect GNP forecast, a GNP forecast from a stress testing case scenario rather than the official GNP forecast. This resulted in a population forecast which, while valid for its inputs, was matched to an incorrect GNP forecast in the fiscal plan. So we had a mismatch, and thus yielded excessively negative population forecasts for that relative to that GNP forecast. Neither the macroeconomic model nor the demographic model had any internal error or incorrect parameters. That is, the error was wholly procedural in nature, not a systematic problem or bias in any model. On discovery of the error, the modeling team reviewed internal processes to ensure better handling in the future. You can rest assured we have all been sufficiently chastened on making sure that those things are matched up. For further questions on that, you can reference the August 1 letter from the FOMB to the governor, which is available in the Oversight Board's website. So with all the business and disclaimers and statements out of the way, let's get to the actual topic, and that is our demographic assumptions. So I've broken this into 5 parts. The first part is fertility. The second part is mortality, then in-migration into Puerto Rico, and then out-migration out of Puerto Rico, and then finally synthesizing it all. However, before I go on, I want to make sure that our systems are all working here. Could someone be so kind as to just send a chat message to everyone so that I know that you all are hearing me? Great. Dr. Santos here is kind. Wonderful. Okay, we're good. Okay, so we'll continue on. So I'm going to start with fertility. So what I have here is Puerto Rico's historic total fertility rate from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And then I have, and that's that light brown line, and then in dark brown, I have a total fertility rate using parameters from the Puerto Rico Community Survey, but then the total value is harmonized to match up with census's estimates of total births, so it's total fertility rate there. And then in red, I have the model outputs for a baseline scenario, and in blue, I have the Census Bureau's official forecast from August 2017. There are 2 things I want to point out here. First, as most of you who are demographically informed know, Puerto Rico has extremely low fertility. Second, the baseline forecast for fertility that we are using for our projections is, if anything, slightly higher, that is more optimistic about future population than the Census Bureau's official pre-hurricane forecast. That is, the FOMB's assumptions have generally relied on fertility assumptions that are that yield a slightly larger population than the Census Bureau's baseline from that forecast, despite the hurricane. So we're not being highly pessimistic here compared to what we might call a highly reputable forecasting body. And I should say that's similar. I'm showing Census Bureau forecasts here. But you could also look at the UN Population Division, and you'll get similar outcomes. And just for comparison, I want you to see Puerto Rico's total fertility rate. This is expected lifetime births per woman versus other U.S. states and territories. And what I want to point out is it's quite low, as in very low, as in lowest. It's right down there with Northern Mariana Islands and things. Now, this isn't just a result of being a territory. I have in darker blue highlighted the territories. Some of them have low fertility, some of them have higher fertility. It's just that Puerto Rico just has very low fertility, and I think that is an under-discussed topic on Puerto Rico's demographic future, is that that births are likely to remain low. Now, Alexis is asking, Lyman, what is the logic for an increase in TFR based on current trends? You may actually be overshooting the birth cohorts. PR is right now in the lowest low TFRs. He's right. It's possible that we are overshooting TFR. However, what we wanted to do was produce a forecast that would be comparable in method and assumptions to forecasts that would be produced by sort of universally recognized bodies like UN Population Division or the World Bank or the Census Bureau. And a conventional assumption, particularly that UN Population Division uses, is a return to replacement rate fertility. So if I can go back here, typically the UN will show on any country a sort of return to replacement. That's that 2.1 line there. We are not forecasting a return to full replacement rate, but we are forecasting some return, just because that is sort of conventional forecasting methodology for major international statistical bodies on this. But I will grant it is possible that that doesn't happen. It's possible that fertility flatlines at lowest low, as we've seen in East Asian countries and some other Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America. And that would be even more pessimistic for population. As it is, we've tried to kind of split the baby between rapid return in fertility and sort of straight lining current numbers. So basically, I've explained all this. We have a gradual return to near replacement levels. We are, if anything, we're slightly, very slightly above what the Census Bureau was forecasting before the hurricane. That's because they chain to a very low level and work off that, and I assume that that very low level was sort of just normal volatility. If you had rapid fertility recovery, so returning to replacement levels in 5 to 7 years, it would increase population in 2060 by about 300,000 people. That is to say, fertility assumptions are a huge driver of long-term population. And I want to emphasize this because I know the sexy topic here is going to be outmigration, but I want to emphasize that by the time you get out to the 2040s, natural population change is a bigger deal than migration. Robin Deshays is asking if the drop in fertility appears to steepen during the Great Recession, what I think would happen if the economy improves. This is a great question, and I've gotten this a couple times as we've developed this, is should there be a cyclical component to fertility? The research on fertility with respect to the business cycle used to be very conventional. Recessions cause baby busts, expansions cause baby booms. That was always the conventional assumption. However, the last 10 or 15 years have really shaken that assumption. That is, we've been seeing a very long expansion in the United States paired with continuing decline in fertility. And we actually see a similar thing in Europe and elsewhere. That is that the previous cyclical nature of fertility, at least in what we might call industrialized economies, doesn't seem to be happening anymore. There could be some rebound. You might get 0.1 or 0.2 kids per woman. It's which is a weird metric to talk about, shares of children. But we opted to go with just sort of a conventional return towards replacement because the current state of the research literature on fertility and economic cycles is very uncertain and really kind of shaken up by particularly the experience of the United States over the last 10 years. So we've gone with a smooth return towards replacement. It's possible that we could get a faster one. I'll go ahead and tell you I don't think it's likely. Particularly, I've seen provisional data out of 2018. And I should say I've seen provisional data out of 2018 from part of Puerto Rico, and it still looks pretty rough. So then the question is, could we have this sharp return? And I should tell you, globally, when we look around, there aren't a lot of sharp jumps above or towards replacement. There are a few, and they all have idiosyncratic explanations that would not apply to Puerto Rico. They usually involve religious or cultural factors. So I want to jump on to people dying. So this, again, the red is model outputs. The light brown is life expectancy from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And oh, sorry, I missed another question from Robin here. She says, it can be argued that Puerto Rico is very different than the mainland U.S. and developed Europe in terms of its stage of economic development. That's true. It could be, which is why when we do this research, I've also looked at a lot of other Latin American countries that are in a, you might argue, in a more similar developmental place. Now, Puerto Rico is a lot higher average income than a lot of Latin America, but we can sort of get at this both angles. We can look at the rich countries and then the Latin American developing country peers. They also do not have, they don't ever seem to make these big bounces up. Jeffrey Farrow, by the way, I'm sorry if I'm dropping anyone's titles here. As it shows up, you don't have a title in my chat box. Jeff Farrow asked, does this take into account migration of people of the age of giving birth? And what is the rationale for forecasting above the Census Bureau forecasts? And I would reiterate, when you ask a question, if you could ask it to everyone instead of just privately, that would be helpful. So I answer these two questions. Yes, I account for migration, absolutely. The whole model is specified on age and sex-specific cohorts that each year, so when I want to see how many people are there in 2038, I take the 2037 age and sex-specific groups, apply their hazard of mortality, their hazard of outmigration, the hazard of someone of that age moving into Puerto Rico, apply all of those, and then we would apply the odds of a given woman having birth. That is to say, this fully accounts for the age and sex composition of outflows, if they were whatever those may be, and we'll get to what those are later on. But here I want, oh, and then what's the rationale for forecasting above the Census Bureau? I briefly mentioned this, I could have harped on it more. Census Bureau, if we go back, you'll notice that they are sort of starting from this lowest low point that I think may be that they kind of picked the low noise, so to speak. You know, all these things, they have noise, and they kind of grab the low noise and forecast it from there. We're kind of forecasting from a central place. It's very similar in the long run. Richard Ingman asks privately again, let's send the messages to everyone. If it is unusual to see big bounces up, is it also unusual to see declines from near 5 births per woman to near 1? And the answer is no, it's not. That's very normal economic development. Well, okay, it's not normal. It's very normal to see from 5 to below 2. The 1.3 or 1.4 Puerto Rico's at, that is very low. There's a lot of Asian countries that are that low. There's a lot of Latin American countries that low. Frederick asks, one drives the other, doesn't in-migration change the fertility rates? And the answer is yes, they're tied together. However, these fertility rates are age-controlled. These are not crude birth rates. These are age-controlled. So whatever the age composition of outflows doesn't, or of inflows, it does not matter for this because these are age-controlled rates. This is So it's not affected by composition changes in the population. It would be effective if inflows or outflows have radically different odds of having children, which we'll talk about that later when we get to in and outflows, but it won't be impacted by compositional changes. This is what's called a total fertility rate. This is called a total fertility rate. So it uses age-specific hazards of having children, not impacted by composition. And I will re-explain, you need to select everyone to get the question out to everyone. So I'm going to go on to mortality. So again, the point here is, again, our model outputs in our baseline scenario, although actually this is a scenario with the hurricane, are very similar to Synthesiz's. They're slightly different. We've put in a slightly more optimistic long-run assumption about increases in life expectancy. But again, we're not talking about worlds of difference here. We're talking about pretty modest differences. And this is basically because Census Bureau has pretty strict rules on what kinds of assumptions they're allowed to make about future life expectancy increases, and I'm not quite as bound. So basically, I assume that technological improvement in life extension and life preservation continues apace, basically. I'm sort of hoping that nobody has any highly methodological questions on this. Mortality forecasting is always an interesting exercise, but this is fairly straightforward. So again, this is the average age that we get from this. And again, you can see that our forecast is very similar to what the Census Bureau had in their pre-hurricane. We're a little bit older, but again, very similar. Population is aging for a variety of reasons, low fertility, extending lifespans, the impact of migration. We're very similar to a benchmark forecast. We're not out in some crazy country making crazy forecasts. So basically, we have very conventional mortality assumptions. We have tried not to be fancy. There are fancy things we could assume about life extension technology or additional hurricanes or the extension of the opioid epidemic from mainland U.S. to Puerto Rico, but we've chosen to be very boring. So we use very conventional assumptions through the demographic fundamentals, fertility and mortality, extremely similar to those used by benchmark agencies, and they are a logical extension of existing data produced by the Census Bureau. That is, we take Census Bureau data, a public benchmark that everyone can access, and basically we just walk it forward in the future in a similar way. So now let's talk about in-migration. This is not out-migration, to be clear. This is not people leaving Puerto Rico, this is people moving in. What I want to show here is that solid blue line is the average for a U.S. state over that period from the American Community Survey. That light greenish-brown line is what Puerto Rico got in that same period. What you will notice is that the typical U.S. state, and I'm including tiny ones such as Rhode Island and Connecticut and things here, and big ones like California, is 3 to 4 times as high as Puerto Rico's. It's just very, very low inflows. We have a question about the audio, and that person can't hear me answer the question, so you must call in at the call-in number. Oh, there we go. Always helpful. Okay, so we have inflows rising, and I should say that this is actually one of, I would say, one of the boldest, most sort of out-of-the-money forecasts that we have. And I know that's sort of a strange thing for someone to say about their own forecast, that if you wanted to call us on something, this would kind of be it, which is that we are expecting that inflows to Puerto Rico will rise substantially. So this is a very optimistic assessment that population is really gonna have some good things happen in the 2020s. And this comes out of a variety of things, particularly our GNP forecast, which I'm not discussing what goes into those today. But basically, we're assuming that there is an appreciable rise in inflows. Now, it's still nowhere near the typical state. And we received what is the basis for of a more optimistic in-migration experience than the historic experience. And so in 2019, you expect an inflow of about 300,000. No, that would be 300,000 would be 10%. This is about 1 to 1.5%. Lots of questions here. This seems to be too optimistic. It's not 300,000 though, I should say. I think it's something more like, I don't have the raw numbers in front of me. I'll get back to you about raw numbers, but I want to again reiterate, this is not from a specific fiscal plan. This is sort of a composite of lots of different scenarios we work on showing our baseline assumptions, right? So these are gross inflows. Now, this is not net in migration. This is gross inflows. I'm getting a question about what the blue line means. That is the state average of interstate flows. So that does not include immigration into U.S. states. The red line for Puerto Rico does include immigration. So I'm, if anything, being more generous to Puerto Rico. Frederica, I don't have the exact number in front of me. I'll have to look at it. But I can get you a full time series on that probably. Certainly I can do that for a historic fiscal plan. But the essential point here is that we are forecasting an appreciable increase in inflows above historic. And I should say the historic here is a widely accepted number. I didn't make that up. It's U.S. Census Bureau. You can look it up yourself. So the question is, why are we forecasting higher inflows? That seems like a bold forecast. And the reason is because a lot of what we're getting here is that we have a period where there is substantially higher GNP growth thanks to a variety of things that our macro modeling team would explain more fully, but essentially faster GNP growth. This is a time where we think Puerto Rico's economy, particularly due to the stimulus of the disaster relief spending, will be humming along pretty well. Furthermore, our assumption is that Puerto Rico's very low inflow rates are in some sense a historic abnormality. And what I mean by that is Puerto Rico's been in a very long recession, and it's been in a recession that since fairly early on, a rational forecaster would have predicted would be very long because the source of it, because of all sorts of components of it. That is, there is this sense that when that recession actually ends, it alters expectations and it improves people's willingness to move to the island. If you didn't do this, if you didn't have this increase in inflows, you would have a much more severe population decline. I got a question, how can the blue line not equal 0%? Because this is just inflows. Again, this is not net inflows. This is gross inflows. So this is average gross inflow rate for U.S. states. I have the question, at least almost all economists in Puerto Rico project continued economic decline for the next years up to a decade. Can they explain the GNP growth? The board says that the growth from disaster will be temporary. Is the model taking into account how the economic activity, real GNP growth, is driving net outmigration? I can't, this call, I can't give you a full rundown on the GNP model. Population is an output of GNP for us, not an input. So I can't answer those questions. I can say, yes, we are accounting for net outmigration. But again, this is just gross inflows. This is not net flows. And I want to be clear here. One great frustration in the whole process of doing this population modeling has been people who confuse gross and net. That is, folks who say, well, 500,000 people left the island in this window. And that's gross flows, not net, because you also have inflows and people will return and all these things. So this is just gross inflows. We are going to get to outflows, which again, I know that's the sexy thing, which is why I put it late, because I want to lay all the foundations before we get to the outflows. So I have another question. At some point, could you discuss whether you examined the impact on assumptions for fertility and mortality, how the composition of the population has been changing in age and education, how this may have been impacted by the hurricane on immediate and shorter-term net migration. So yes, I am going to look very laser-focused in on the hurricane here. We do not know yet the age composition of post-hurricane outflows. There are some surveys. There are some ways we can back into it, but we don't have any sufficiently robust evidence on this for us to justify putting it into the model. And basically, for me, sufficiently robust estimates means an official, publicly published government source that tells me the age or educational composition of out-migrants. Without that information, I assume similar profile of the out-migrant from the past, which is in keeping with a lot of literature on crisis migration internationally. I think that answered the question. The question is, only 30,000 Puerto Ricans returned post-Maria. So that's a good question. If people move out of Puerto Rico in a given year and they move back in the same year, they don't show up as a migrant at all for the Census Bureau's methodology. Okay, so this is important. Actually, this is sort of a fun methodological question, is when does somebody need to leave and for how long for them to show up as a migrant? And I'm sure we could have a long conversation about what that should be in theory, but I'm tied to the Census Bureau definition, and because we are using, I believe it's a July-June fiscal year is our definition here. Someone can correct me on that if I'm out if I'm out a month, but that's also harmonized with Census Bureau, which estimates July population. Their estimate is July, not January. So the idea here is that if a person leaves in November and returns in February, as far as the Census Bureau is concerned, they did not migrate, right? They went on a very long involuntary vacation. Am I including in-migration from any location other than continental U.S.? Yes, this is inflows from everywhere. And yes, I use the same definition for out-migration. So if a person has returned before the end of the year in which they left, they are not an out-migrant. So I'm harmonized definitions. And again, I didn't invent these definitions. They are Census Bureau definitions. They're how they do it for the population estimate series. They're how they used to do it for the decennial census, and they're how they do it for the American Community Survey and the Puerto Rican Community Survey. I wish that we had a more granular and fine-tuned way that Census Bureau would estimate these things. Alas, we live in a world of limitations. Okay, so I think that's in-migration. Yes. Good suggestion here. We will move on to the next thing. So this, again, just showing that Puerto Rico's in-migration is extremely low, atypically low, unusually low. There's a lot of reasons for that, but for a state economic area its size, Puerto Rico should have much lower inflows, and that's even when you include other island areas like Hawaii or Virgin Islands. There's very low inflows. Not a lot of people moving there. So we forecast a considerable increase in inflows. But even an extremely strong increase in inflows, consistent with improved economic opportunity for a while, doesn't get Puerto Rico anywhere close to the experience of what we might call a statistically normal state. And I should say a big driver of this is immigration, that Puerto Rico has about 1/4 of the immigration rate that other states have. Okay, now let's talk about out-migration. I know that this is the big one. This is the really interesting one. So the first thing I want to do is I want to walk through different ways we could estimate out-migration. One is the American Community Survey and the Puerto Rican Community Survey, a huge annual survey. It's released with an 18-month lag, and I should say this is our preferred source for estimating the composition of outflows. And this is ultimately our preferred source for migration. The problem is It has an 18-month lag, and also the way it estimates data, it's going to make estimating hurricane-related migration very interesting, just because it uses a different time window than we do, but it's what census uses, and we're ultimately tied in the long run to census. So the next option is the current population survey in the population estimates program. This is from annual survey data, but the CPS has a small sample, and it's released on a 10-month lag. So again, there's a long lag. The CPS is a much smaller sample, and also the academic literature is starting to show that the current population survey's migration question has a very large reporting error in it, sufficiently large that it's really raising some questions about the viability of the question for estimating population for local areas. The next is IRS data. I love IRS data for mainland locations because it's full population administrative data, but it's actually only full population of previous federal income tax filers, which is a problem on Puerto Rico because there are people not filing federal income taxes. So you get a very warped sample, and it doesn't estimate very well for Puerto Rico. And furthermore, it's erratically produced. It doesn't really have as regular a reporting schedule as we would like. The next is Department of Transportation air traffic data. It is full population administrative data, provided a person is flying, not some other means of transportation. It has a 3 to 6 month lag depending on the domestic or the international component. Problem it does have is it includes many temporary moves, which is a point raised often about this data, but I'll talk more about later. And I should say this is the data that we use for updating and monitoring our forecast progress. Next possibility is Medicare data. We can look at administrative data for specific population groups who use Medicare. The trouble is, it's a pain in the butt to get this data. You have to make special requests for data disclosures. It's burdensome to obtain. At least that's been my experience. So while we can occasionally use this for special purposes, the extraordinary difficulty in obtaining it and the delay associated with that means it's not really viable for the frequency of updating our forecast and the time windows that we need. The next is USPS address change data. It's administrative data reflecting planned, semi-permanent, or permanent household relocations. But again, it's only available through specific administrative data disclosure requests. That is, I can't just get online and download it. I have to ask for it. And then the problem with that is there are delays, and then you don't really know if you're getting exactly what you thought you were getting. And from my perspective, another big problem with USPS data is none of you guys can verify it. That is, if I say I'm using it and you say, well, how do you know it's correct? I say, well, I can look at it, but you all can't. And my preference is to use data that is transparent and can be vetted by outsiders. Next is cell phone location data. This is a fun one. It's natural data collected by private firms. And the trouble is, it's natural data collected by private firms. It's not generally available on a regular basis, in a public basis, in a format that can be readily followed. And also, there's not a long literature on the accuracy of this data, and because often the firm it comes from is anonymous, we don't know what coverage biases might exist. Then you have school enrollment data, which we do look at this to get an approximate estimate of student departures versus what we might expect from the aging of given cohorts. We can look at residential utility usage. There's a lot of literature on using electricity stuff and other things to estimate population change. It's an interesting thing. It's kind of indirect and labor intensive, but it can be done. I'd be interested in doing it, but at this point, we haven't really had a good way to get that data. And finally, FEMA aid applications has been a fun one to look at. Actually a really sad one, to be honest, but an interesting one. It's, again, administrative data. The problem is sometimes you worry about the accuracy of the address listed, and also it's only people who request aid. That is really a convenient sample, and we're not sure if that's really a good estimate. Now, the convenient thing is when we take all these, and there's some that we don't have data from, there's some that we do have data from, and we can kind of plug the estimates they do give in and get a range. we have to make some assumptions and different things, but we can get a range out of each of these sources. And we can see, well, if you believe this source, about what would outmigration probably be in 2017-18. So here it is in graphical form. And what you can see is there isn't much disagreement. It's somewhere between like 4.8 and 5.9% probably. Pretty much we have overlap there. Now there's wide ranges on all these things, but they have overlap places that look pretty consistent. And of course our best source, the air traffic data, has the smallest range just because we have the most we have the most data history on it, so we can specify the best model fit for it. And I should say this is with only like 2 or maybe 3 months left in the data year for the air traffic. I think April might be the latest, so we just need May and June, and then we have everything. So we're really only forecasting 2 months to get a range. So the point is, oh, and another source is you can look at Google search traffic, which is a fun one, but I haven't quite come up with a good way to specify forecasts for that because the series seems to kind of change what it means a couple times historically. And there's a question, is this annualized? Yes, this is annualized. This is including what we know before the hurricane, after the hurricane, and forecasting out for the remainder of the year, making adjustments for whether we're talking about households or individuals or children or whatever. This is trying to say, using this data, what would it imply about the annual total for the whole population? And that's why some of these ranges are large, is that sometimes this data source isn't actually talking about the whole population. So we have to sort of make adjustments to get to the whole population and to annualize, because often this data is not annualized. So why do we use the air passenger data? Well, first of all, as we actually have someone on this call who could has published or will soon publish the definitive paper on this, but using a 2000 census baseline in births from the CDC and deaths from the CDC and Department of Transport net air passenger flows, that predicts the 2010 census results to within a very small margin of error. It's way better than the Census Bureau's official forecasting team did it. The official forecasting team was not close to as accurate as the method as using the air passenger data. It's been tested by academics, think tanks. It's found to be predictively useful, and also because it has a very well-defined seasonal pattern. It helps us see when we've got very weird moments. Also, when you annualize it up along the right time windows, it closely tracks American Community Survey, Puerto Rico Community Survey, CPS survey-based estimates. So it matches up to the gold standard surveys pretty well, but it's more timely, which is nice. It is a nearly complete universe of migration data. It does miss maritime arrivals and departures. I've struggled to find data on maritime arrivals and departures. If anyone knows of a source for it, I would be very gratified to learn. It's verified at multiple points. Occasionally I've had questions brought up to me saying, well, how do you know that you're not getting, false information? How do you know that it's not in some sense manipulated? And the answer is it's double verified. You got origin and destination reporting. So if one of them mismatches, Department of Transportation forces them to sit down and sort it out. So it's difficult to manipulate. It consistently yields estimates that are well within the range of even very idiosyncratic sources, like those data, the data I was just listing in the previous slides. So it yields an estimate that's within the range of those. And finally, it allows us to tie to a public data source, which is a benefit for transparency. It means you all can check our work. And speaking of checking our work, Robin Deshays says DOT data has changed significantly each month, currently at negative 4.5%, likely will be big difference between April and October. And that's a great point. And this is what I love about this. Because we use public stuff, you all can check us. So there's a very defined seasonal pattern to a normal year of air traffic in Puerto Rico. So we can look at the normal seasonal pace. This year was unusual because we got huge outflows in a month that is normally substantial inflows, and that's because of hurricanes. So we had to make adjustments to the normal seasonal pattern. But the point is, I go ahead and I put in my assessment of what the remainder of the year is likely to look like. So I'm not just taking lagged 12 months, I am taking year to date plus a forecast of remaining months, all right? So I'm looking at the normal seasonal pace. I'm looking at how much recent months have diverged from the normal seasonal pace. I'm looking at the most recent other sources of monthly data to get any sense of demands to go back into Puerto Rico. I look at Google searches. I look at real estate stuff. I look at employment monthly data, anything that can get a hint of what the remainder of the year might look like, I look at and try and use that to estimate the missing months, the remaining months of data. I do not have right in front of me what things are looking like right now, but that's essentially the method. So here's outmigration. Again, I want to emphasize, historically, Puerto Rico has had lower than, oh, Robin DeShay says you can get ports data in real time. Robin, if you don't mind to shoot me an email with a link to that, I would love it, particularly with a historic time series. So we've got the blue line for the U.S. state average rate of outmigration, about 3.5%. And then we have what actually happened in Puerto Rico in the light brown. And what I want to emphasize again is that Puerto Rico has historically had lower than average outflows. And I know that that's going to surprise, but the important thing here is that the outflows were low, but the inflows are so low that the net flows are unusually negative. Puerto Rico has unusually negative net flows, but they are not actually unusually bad gross flows. Now, they were worsening, and then we have that spike for the hurricane. So I guess that's showing like 5.5% or something. Again, this is not from a specific fiscal plan. This is sort of a dummy population run because basically for disclosure reasons, I couldn't put an exact fiscal plan in here as the fiscal plans are in fact certified and constitute an official estimate, and this is for informational purposes only and not an official estimation. So what you can see is that we have that spike in outflows, then it falls, and we very rapidly get to outflow rates substantially below what they were before the hurricane. Then we have them sort of flat, and then we have them declining over time. If anyone has a strong preference about what this should actually be, I'd be interested to hear it. This is essentially just saying a return to kind of normal outmigration from pre-hurricane levels. You'll see it's similar to what it was in 2011. It's essentially an output of our GNP forecast. I think we talked about a lot of this with the inflows. So similar type of situation here. I'm not sure if anyone has a specific question about that. So we can't compare the U.S. Census Bureau forecast for outflows because those forecasts don't have the hurricane. Okay. So how can it be lower? I don't know if Andy is on the call, but if he is or not, he will not be addressing GNP forecast today. Yeah, this call is only for the demographic component. I'm sure if he were on here, he'd be very popular. So the question is, how can it be lower than pre-Maria? That's a good question. It could theoretically be higher, but one thing that we notice in a number of other crisis demographic scenarios is it seems like part of what happens in crisis migration is that a lot of migration gets pulled forward. So you get a situation where you have outflows that would have happened in 2021, but now they happened in 2017-18. So there's some pulling forward of outflows here. And then the other thing is that our GNP forecast does have better growth in the 2020s. And so that helps move things down. What is my level of confidence for this figure? What is the potential range based on April DOT data? I believe that this would be the potential range from April DOT data. So it's something like maybe that's 4.7% to 5.9. So that is a substantial range, but that's approximately the range that it looks like. This year is obviously difficult to tell the seasonal pattern because it's so out of whack, both on outflows and in returns. There's a question about normal migration. What I meant by it in that moment was talking about 2011, 2012. But yes, I look at flows back to, I believe my long run balance sheet for Puerto Rico runs back to the 1920s. But I have to check that. So I have a long time series for migration patterns. Any reason for the increase in 2028? That is going to be something to do with our GNP forecast. Not totally sure exactly off the top of my head because I don't have the GNP numbers right in front of me. It would be something related to that. At what point would you be comfortable that the distortion in flows from hurricanes would be out of the data? In terms of the seasonal distortion, I think probably by the end of 2018, we should be no longer seeing seasonal distortions from Hurricanes Irma and Maria. There will be new events that will distort things, but those distortions should be worked out by then, by the end of calendar 2018. Now, you may get what we might call a longer run distortion, which is what I was talking about with pulling migration forward. That is, it's not changing the seasonal pattern. It's saying, well, this person might have moved in 2022, but instead now it's 2018. Are there alternative population projections for alternative GNP scenarios? Yes, absolutely there are. Anytime we run a new GNP scenario, we run a new population projection. So that was what I was explaining in the forecast error statement at the beginning. Was the error that we had was that we accidentally published a population projection from an alternative GNP scenario other than the one that was certified for the fiscal plan. That is to say, yes, there are alternative projections for different GNP scenarios, where are those available? I do not know the status of there is no officially certified alternative population projection. There's no official alternative. That would be sort of an odd thing to have. As far as running specific scenarios, that would be a question to pass to someone with more legal expertise than me, unfortunately. I can't just run scenario after scenario for fun. But yes, anytime there's a different GNP scenario, there's a different population scenario because GNP and economic factors are what drives particularly migration. Our inputs are not disaggregated by economic information, so I don't have, I can't tell you like the median income of these people in 2048 that I'm forecasting will be there. But an economic shock has an impact on migration. So if a GNP forecast says the economy will rise by 2% and in the next year it will fall by 4%, I'm not saying that's an actual forecast, I'm just giving an example, you would expect that migration would respond differently to 2% growth than -4% growth. So when I say it responds to GNP, what I mean is that in the long run, particularly migration has, the other things not so much, but particularly migration does have a response to GNP. What is the empirical relationship? That is a great question. So let's carry on, and I will get to some of that. So can't compare, I'm not ignoring the question. It's later in the presentation. So we can't compare migration to the Census Bureau forecasts because they made their forecasts right before the hurricane, which is really convenient for benchmarking a model. So they're missing important events and data. Our forecast that outflows will drop sharply in the next year and then continue to fall through the whole period can be considered cautiously optimistic. So let's start putting this all together. The model is specified to single year of age and sex, applying year, age, sex specific fertility, mortality, outflow, inflow hazards to each group, as I mentioned earlier. And it is specified in such a way that the baseline condition, that is, if I put in no new shocks, no new anything, it essentially duplicates the Census Bureau's August 2017 Puerto Rico forecast. So if I put in no shocks to my model, I just run it in the baseline condition. The red line is what the model spits out, and the blue line is what the Census Bureau was forecasting before the hurricane. There's a question about the forecast for inflation. Again, this call is only on the demographic side of things. I cannot answer about inflation. Given the importance of DOT data, would it be prudent to wait for December 2018 DOT data to get a fix on the short-term net migration effects on GNP rather than going with June 2018? There is always another data set you can wait for. I do not set the timeline, and I am not in charge of that, and so I can't really comment to the prudent balance of waiting for more data versus certifying at a certain time. That's not within my decision-making capability. How do you get age-specific migration from DOT? I do not. I get total net flows estimated from DOT, and then I assume that the generally the age-specific rate of migration, the relative age-specific rates of migration will be similar to what they were in the past, and I adjust the total amount for the total I get from DOT, and then the age-specific composition that flows out of that is a model output. So essentially, the model looks at previous age mix of outflows in a sense, or rather the previous hazard of outflow for a given age sex group, and applies it to how many of that group are in a given year, with the caveat that the total amount that flows out must match the output from the DOT-based model. So I am not assuming any change in the age composition of, or in the sensitivity of a given age sex group to migration. The source for age composition is the Puerto Rico Community Survey and the American Community Survey. So that's the source for age and sex-specific rates of outflow. So that's publicly available from Census's website or from the, well, Census website is the easiest place to get it. So all this to say, the benchline model, the benchline specification, so if I put nothing in about hurricanes, I duplicate the Census model. I have done what Census did essentially. Yeah, there's a little bit of a gap in 1 year, in a few years, but it's essentially the Census model. So it is very similar to that, and it is essentially a reproduction of this benchmark model. So the reason we wanted to do this is because we wanted to produce a forecast that would be comparable to Census, and it would be similar in methodology to Census because, of course, the Census is the sort of legal authority on population models. Oh, I mean, ultimately the 2020 Census will be. So we wanted to harmonize with their method, and that means producing a model that matches the Census benchmark. Now, you may disagree with the Census benchmark itself. If you do, I would urge you to take it up with Census. So at the benchmark model, we can compare net migration rates. So the blue line is what Census has in their benchmark model. The red line is what I have in my model trying to duplicate their benchmark. What you'll notice is that Census's benchmark model is very linear with very pointy points on it and then very flat for the later periods. Our model is a little bit smoother even when we duplicate Census. That's just because census is a little more bound by specific forecasting rules, whereas I have a little more liberty to make outputs that are slightly more real-world shaped, you might say. But the point is, in the long run, these are extremely similar forecasts. So the baseline condition matches census and total population, matches essentially in fertility, in life expectancy, basically matches census's forecast even at the component level. So it's not just the total level matches, it's that even down to the components, even down to most age and sex subpopulations, our baseline model matches census's estimates. So if I'm understanding your model is an output of the GNP model, does that mean census model is an output of economic forecasts? I do not know what assumptions census uses for their GNP forecasts. You would have to ask them that. I was just duplicating their demographic outputs, and then we have shocks that we get from our GNP series. So then we've got to apply those shocks to the census benchmark forecast. So obviously there's a shock like a hurricane. So at this point, we are late enough in 1718 that regarding TFR, yes, both the census model and the model we use forecasts an increase in the total fertility rate. So at this point, though, for 1718, so that's essentially, for population terms, July 17 to July 18, TFR is, so the question is, from 2010 to 2017, birth data points out a decreasing average around 2,500 yearly. What insight is leading to this trend change in the very next years? There's not a trend change in total births. We have total births declining because the childbearing population, so women ages 15 to 50, is declining. So births are declining. But we do have births per woman going up slightly. So we still have births declining in the long run. The TFR increase does not fully offset the childbearing population decline. So back to 2017-18. At this point, whenever there's a change in the estimate for GNP for 17-18, it has no impact on the population estimates for 2017-18. The reason for that is because I'm using actual data. I mean, we are done with the 17-18 year, demographically speaking. We're still getting data on it. We don't have full birth, death, and net movement data. But at this point, there's just not a lot of the year left for economic data to move. So at this point, the hurricane shock, I don't need any assumption about that. I know what happened. We're still waiting on some actual data, but we're basically getting there. It doesn't require any particular assumptions about elasticity of migration, or we don't have to compare to like what happened in Katrina, how many people left. We basically can see the shock at this point. We're very close, we're getting very close to normal seasonality in net movement. I think we'll still have some distortion for a few months, but the meat of the distortion is past. Births and deaths seem to be moving back towards seasonal norm. We are, so the 17-18 forecast component isn't really sensitive to GNP anymore because it's actual. But future years need estimates. So this is where it starts to get interesting. How do we estimate particularly the sensitivity of migration? So the literature on interstate migration produces a wide range of estimates on this topic. So there are a lot of papers looking at U.S. states or sometimes metro areas that produce a wide range of estimates for how sensitive migration is to things like an unexpected economic shock or a hurricane. And there is very little agreement about the exact elasticity to use. So, you know, should a 1% exogenous shock to GNP cause 1% change in migration? Should it cause a 2%? Should it be 0.5%? There's really very little agreement, and the elasticities, unfortunately, the estimates in the literature spread pretty decisively to both sides of one. That is, you get papers with good methodologies saying elasticity would be something like 0.3 or 0.5. And you get something, no, it's 2. The trouble with this is that this does not give me a lot to work with. So what I do is I try and use as many outputs as I can. So I create a range of elasticities, essentially somewhere between 0.5 and 1.5, because that seems to be the general view of the literature on that it's somewhere in there. The sensitivity of migration to a given economic shock is somewhere in there, right? So I make a range. We have a real issue. So Kate Long asked, we have a real issue where 17-18 tax revenues refute the idea that GNP contracted 13%, which the current fiscal plan shows. Again, I can't really discuss GNP contractions. That's the macro team. What I can say is the GNP estimate has no impact on the 17-18 population estimate at this point, because the 17-18 population estimate at this point is based on actual data. So that would be a question for the macroeconomic team on that. Whatever the actual GNP change is, whether it's, 50%, 20%, 13%, 2%, 0.5%, at this point, it doesn't matter for 17-18. Sorry if I wasn't entirely clear on that. So we get a wide range of elasticities. So I welcome, if anyone here has a paper that they think I missed that provides an estimate for the sensitivity of particularly intermetro or interstate migration to an exogenous economic shock, I would be very interested to see that. Feel free to pass it along. I'm always looking for information. I love nothing more than when someone shows me a way I can improve what I'm doing. Actually, Kate knows this well, as she often is tweeting things at me that she thinks that I should be reading, which I appreciate. I genuinely do appreciate. So if you think I've missed some estimate of the migration response to an economic shock, let me know. I am genuinely happy to see it. I want to make sure that I am using the best, latest, most credible estimates on this, which is really why we're doing this call, is because I'd really love if some of you all have something that you can help us improve on. So I take a range of elasticities for migration responsiveness. I create a field of possible outcomes. So I basically run the model, produce sort of a range of possible migration responses there could be to a shock based on different elasticity outputs or different elasticity estimates. And then I simply try to ensure that the model estimates remain within that band. And the goal is to stay inside that band generally. This is particularly challenging because there's sometimes ambiguity in the literature between income shocks and income as a variable at the higher part of the range. So the ambiguity here, because some of the literature isn't totally clear on which one they're measuring, we tend to bias a little bit towards the higher part of this range of elasticities, but we do generally try and stay within it. So that is the presentation. I have another question here. It says, how does Puerto Rican migration perform to other big hurricanes like Georgia's? Could that be a reference to take into account in the model? That's a good question. The migration response to previous hurricanes seems to have been somewhat smaller from the data that we do have. Unfortunately, historically, a lot of the data we have from before the 2000s is not one-year data. It's 5-year data. It's, how many people moved over this 5-year period? How many people moved over this 10-year period? We do have some one-year data, but really just data quality, particularly before the 2000s for Puerto Rico, is not great on the population movement question. With the arrival of the American Community Survey in 2001 in its provisional form, in 2007 in the form we have it now, we got a lot better data. And then my time series of passenger traffic that I'm working with goes back to, I think, 2001. If somebody has it back to, Alexis is saying it goes back much farther, somebody shoot me a link, and actually that'd be wonderful. Somebody shoots me a link, I can run the time series back further. I'd love to do that. Are you conducting any empirical modeling? Well, I should say I have looked at, there's some literature on this that I've read a couple papers, but hurricanes are idiosyncratic events. Even hurricane to hurricane is different because a big hurricane, the exact details of how it hits, what it destroys, the surrounding context, these all matter. So you can do some with past hurricanes, but there's a limit to what you can do. And again, in the current year for 17-18, we don't need to model. There's no model necessity for the current year, which has the hurricane event. We have the actual data. So there's another question. Are you conducting any empirical modeling to determine how model inputs will respond to GMP, or is this only from secondary literature? I have not been conditioned to do commissioned to do fully independent empirical modeling on those responses. And honestly, I think that it is better to leave that to academics for the simple reason that the peer review process is going to get more methodological experts giving input on it than I'm going to get writing a paper. So I think it's best to leave the empirical modeling component and the estimation of elasticities to academics who specialize in solving thorny methodological questions like how to identify an exogenous income shock. And that question is not for me. Is there an example of any country with a similar increase in the TFR trend? There are countries with increasing TFRs, particularly a lot of Eastern European countries right now have rising TFRs. There are a few others. So there's an interesting question here that always bedevils modelers is convention versus intuition. And you look around and you say, well, how many countries have rising TFRs? And the answer is not a lot. How many countries as low as Puerto Rico have eventually shown rising TFRs? And the answer is not a lot. And most of those that did had policy changes involving fertility incentives. At the same time, we are committed to using sort of benchmark estimation procedures. We don't want to get fancy. So the idea is that it is normal and typical, for example, with the UN population divisions methods, to forecast some degree of return to replacement. It's the long-run assumption is that human populations bias towards replacement rate. Now, it may be that that doesn't end up true in 50 years. If it doesn't end up true, there's larger global questions about the economy and global labor force availability. But it's normal and conventional, and it's considered best practice by most population forecasting institutions to assume some degree of replacement, return towards replacement. The question here is, if you want an example of any country with an increase in TFR trend, I've got a bunch of them, but many of them have idiosyncratic events. So can you go back then to how you replicated the Census Bureau? Yes, so basically I built an age-specific cohort model. So there's a cell for 27-year-old women, there's a cell for 56-year-old men, there's a cell for each age and sex group. And I put in parameters that would duplicate the Census Bureau, not just its total, but its component levels. So life expectancy were very similar. Fertility were quite similar. Average age were quite similar. Well, we can't show this with a hurricane, but total population is quite similar, and net migration is a little different, but is still very similar. So the question of how I did it, I don't know how in the weeds you want this. I mean, essentially, I simply made sure that all the formulas in the model, when there's no shock put on them, when I have an adjuster that I can say, well, specify the shock to this, that when that is at 0, or rather at 1 is the baseline condition, that it duplicates the census output. I don't really know how to explain the method more thoroughly because it's simply a formulaic thing. Duplicating Census Bureau is pretty straightforward. Oh yeah, so the net migration is a little bit different. Some of that is a timing thing. I'm actually just noticing here that I have shifted the model output over by a year. You'll notice that on the left side, they look very similar but shifted by a year. I think I have just copied it in the spreadsheet slightly differently, so that would make them a bit more similar. But yeah, it's not exactly the same. Census has this very rigid methodology that they want to, you'll notice they have like a fixed, I think it's 8,000 person net migration every year from 2026 out. I tend to fix a percentage rather than absolute amount. So I'm more likely to try and smooth the percent rate of decline than the absolute value. Census prefers to chain the absolute value. It's a modest difference. The key thing is that we're matching paths, and in total these add up pretty well. But yeah, they choose to lock in a specific number. I think it's a little more correct to lock in a rate, but Census Bureau has to, they kind of have a KISS rule, keep it simple, stupid. And I try and do that too, but this is one where I just felt that was a bit too, not just simple, but a bit too simplistic. I'm not sure that it's really more convincing to show just a flat line. We have 6 minutes remaining on the scheduled call, I believe. Or maybe we have more. Maybe we have 12 minutes remaining. The population, so that'd be this, I think. Maggie, if this is what you're looking for, let me know. If it's not, you can also let me know. Yes, great, yeah. So this is it. And so we are a little bit lower in some of these years, not a lot, and we end very similar. Yeah, we end quite similar. A little bit different in the middle period, but that's just because I'm smoothing in a slightly different way than Census is. I'll also say we don't have a question right now. Anytime you all do have a specific question about this, you know, I'm not a hard guy to find. I cannot give you any privileged information, and I can't actually answer your question, but you can always ensure that your question or concern is being heard by telling me what your question is. I can't turn around and say, well, actually, the answer is this. But I can at least assure you that it's being heard. And if you're asking something that might be public, but you just don't know where to find it, I can also help you with things like that. Do you have a similar figure with the projected post-hurricane inputs? I do not. So Maggie's asking, do I have a similar figure where I'm comparing our actual forecast, not our baseline, but our actual with the outputs? And I do not. And the reason is because when I was producing this fiscal plan, because I'm only the demographer, not this fiscal plan, this presentation, because I'm only the demographer and not a process expert, I was not sure what things would be released, what things wouldn't be released. So all of the data in this, where I'm showing things that include the hurricane, like, let me get to one. Like here, this includes the hurricane. All of the data that includes the hurricane year is not actually from a specific fiscal plan. It's from me creating a slightly different scenario from any other fiscal plan for the purpose of illustration. It's very similar to what you would find, but it is slightly different because I wasn't sure what things would be released at what times, and I wanted to make sure I was not accidentally disclosing something that shouldn't be, so this is illustrative. But to that end, I didn't want to put up a direct population comparison, because I didn't want to mislead anyone into thinking that that was the population figure and we were releasing something. There's a question about, could we have an inflation session to discuss those assumptions? I am not in charge of that. I can't really answer that. But the question has been asked. Other questions? I'm not seeing any others, but I'm going to chill out on here until 4:30. When you do your population projection, what do you use as the base year? What do you use as the base year? That's a great question. I use the most recent year for which Census Bureau has released complete age and sex-specific population estimates. Okay, so what is that now? I think right now we have July 2017 in. I believe I've updated for July 2017 from the vintage 2017 estimates. I should say that, actually this is a very good moment to say this. In, I believe, September, Census Bureau will start releasing vintage 2018 estimates. I'm not sure when they'll release state level and Puerto Rico estimates, but at some point they will. And when they will produce an estimate of Puerto Rico's population on July of 2018. If they use the method they have used in the past to estimate July 2018 population, it will be horribly wrong if they use that previous method. Because in the past, they use Puerto Rico Community Survey data, and they take the most recent year and they just roll it through the current years. And remember I said the PRCS data is delayed by 18 months, so the most recent data Census would have available would not reflect hurricane migration, and they would use it to estimate 2018 population, so you can see how that would be a problem. I do not know what method Census will use. I have no spy network within Census Bureau, but my sincere hope is that they will recognize that this would be an issue and that they will use some different method, perhaps use Department of Transportation data. I'm hoping that the census data centers that work on Puerto Rico and their advisors who work on Puerto Rico will advise them of this. I do not know what they will do, but if Census releases a July 2018 number that is using a methodology that we have reason to believe is woefully incorrect, then we will have to cross that bridge when we come to it and determine what our path forward is. Because at this point, we have committed to using the census as a baseline because it is accurate and also because it is the Census Bureau. We don't know what we would do if it was still the Census Bureau, but not accurate. The next question is, if I read your graph correctly, your projection anticipates that in 2030, the PR population you project at 2.75 million. No, so this is what it is in the baseline census duplicating, in 2030. Yeah, so this is the baseline census duplicating method. This is not the actual fiscal plan. This is what the Census Bureau forecasts. So why does the Census Bureau forecast that even without the hurricane? I don't know. Now, if you're interested in a long time series of Puerto Rico population, I have one. I can share that. I believe I have everyone's email addresses. Actually, I can talk and see if there's a way that we can produce a document that would answer some of these questions. I can't promise we can do that, but I can see if it is a possibility. There's a question, Lyman, is this a self-feeding process? Like, do the demographic projections forecast impact the GNP ones, and then is it a self-feeding loop of influence? Great question, and the answer is no. GNP flows to population for us. Population does not flow back to GNP. There's a big question on this. In fact, I know there have been specific questions about why do we use an investment-driven model, not a population one. Now, I can't answer that question because that's a macro question. Why do we use a specific macro model? But what I can tell you is we don't use any coefficient for population's impact on GNP. And the reason for this is that the research on population's impact on macroeconomics is limited. There's actually very few papers that have done this in a rigorous way. It's sort of something people assume, and then there's only like 3 papers that actually rigorously show some sort of exogenous effect of population or migration on GNP. And so given that the state of the literature is infantile on that topic, I don't mean infantile meaning the papers are bad. The papers are interesting and good, but infantile meaning very small and still growing. We've decided it is best to allow that literature to continue to develop before we base very high-profile forecasts on what is a very new literature. If I understand you are employing a cohort component method, yes. Have you considered exploring Bayesian methods? I have considered exploring it, yes. We have not done it. I will say I've considered exploring it. There's various reasons we don't do this, partly because Bayesian methods get even harder to explain to people, particularly, I'll say to Congress. So we're concerned to use a method that is straightforward. Now, I definitely am interested in using other methods, but again, I don't think that it's going to yield a very different result. The UN's Bayesian forecasts are not radically different from the cohort component ones. Now, what they do allow you to do is they give you a margin of error, which is nice to have. At the same time, I sometimes worry about margins of error because you start to convince yourself that you know all the unknowns when you really don't. But yeah, for now we're just a cohort component method. But I have started exploring how we can supplement this because I do want to be making the best. How does your projection of net migration change for FY18 compared to the negative 5.8% projected in the fiscal plan? That's an interesting question. I think that I am not sure if I can answer that right now. I have said things on my Twitter in my personal capacity about where we are. This call, you'll notice the demographic intelligence logo on each slide. It is me speaking as an advisor of demographic intelligence. This is not the board committing to these graphs, but I want to be wary of not saying something that appears to have the imprimatur of the board contradicting itself. So I'm not going to say a net migration estimate for 17-18 right now because I don't want to give the impression that there's some kind of disagreement or division there. So I'm regrettably won't answer that right now. Are you projecting an increase in student population as a result? No, the child population continues to decline under virtually all specifications, pretty much any specification. I've heard. I appreciate Dr. Santos's comment, re GNP and population structure. We have a, I always appreciate more people doing good forecasting work. So I would say if we're wrong, I invite, strongly encourage, in fact, others to produce forecasts and to publish them. The more the merrier is my attitude. I would, in fact, rather not have a monopoly on forecasting Puerto Rico. So it is time here, and I have, I believe I have to go. I think My cross-reference. Yes, Kate, I have looked at what we know thus far about Medicaid. If you're talking about in the fiscal plan, the projections, they should be compatible and coming from the same place. Now, I don't determine who is Medicaid eligible in terms of the income levels and things, but the Medicaid population is estimated based on my my population projections, or at least it ought to be. So with that, folks, I have to go, but thank you for coming on the call. Thank you for your questions. And I do believe that we recorded this, and I hope that you feel your questions have been heard and hopefully satisfactorily answered. On the ones that were not, I know there were a lot of questions about GNP and inflation and these things. I wish I could answer them, but again, we live in a world of limitations. So thank you for your time.